The Rebel Capitalist Show.
All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome someone to the Rebel Capitalist Show that I have really looked forward to speaking with. He is a regular on Grant Williams and Bill Fleckenstein's Endgame podcast. I've seen him many times on Real Vision. He is a gold expert, but I'll let you tell him about his own backstory, which is fascinating. His name is Simon Mikhailovich. Simon, welcome to the Rebel Capitalist Show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so let's just go right into your backstory. It's fascinating how you grew up and how you take your history and it helps you kind of build your framework in the way that you see the world today, especially the Western world.
Sure. So I was born in 1959 in the Soviet Union in St. Petersburg and grew up there until I was 19. Graduated from high school, 2 years of college, studying engineering. And we emigrated with the whole family, my parents and my grandparents, in 1978 when I was 19. So this period from 60s and 70s was a very interesting time in the Soviet Union in the sense that I caught, I guess I can say, the least pernicious part of the entire 75-year Soviet history.
Right.
Because obviously my grandparents who survived, who were born before the revolution, had to live through an overthrow of the, collapse of the system, civil war, military communism, Stalin's repressions, World War II. And then 3 of the 4 of them ended up in the siege of Leningrad and survived that. Growing up, I was playing with these beautiful pieces of paper that turned out they were government bonds. The Soviets defaulted on. These were like war bonds, and I'm sure they had them in the United States, but they had them in the Soviet Union too. And I didn't know what they were until I became much older, but they were worthless. And so, but the time I was born, this was the last monetary reform was in 1961. So when I was 2 years old, when people lost their money yet again. And growing up, it was probably as benign a period. Not that it was benign, but it was as benign as one could have under the Soviet regime. I mean, we were, I guess, lower middle class economically by the standards of the United States. We were upper middle class by the standards of the Soviet society. My father was a photographer. My mother was an engineer, a successful freelance photographer. My mother was an engineer. My grandmother was a doctor. I mean, it was a normal family. We had a car and, a little cottage in the country. So it's not like I grew up in this black and white movie that people think of when they think of the Soviet Union. And the 60s were, I don't remember the 60s very well. I was little. But by the time the 70s came, the Soviet Union has gotten into stagnation. And so the economy started stagnating. Nothing was going anywhere, meaning people had the same jobs, the same salaries, lived in the same apartments. It took 12 years to get a phone line. You had to know somebody. It became more and more difficult to get decent food. If you wanted it, you had to go to the farmer's market where very few people could afford it. In the meantime, the elites, I guess, the party oligarchy or whatever you want to call it, they had their own transportation system. They had their own system of sanatoriums for, resorts, their own cars in the trains. Any of that sounds familiar to you?
Yeah, right.
Their own restaurants where they could get in and other people couldn't get in. And normal people, even like upper middle class people, had no access to any of that. And of course, working people, forget it. And so as the inequality started growing at that level, now I'm not comparing it necessarily directly to the United States, but I'm just saying the sign. Inequality started growing. The government propaganda intensified because the ability or inability to explain coherently why there's no meat in the stores while every GNP 5-year plan was always overfulfilled and everything was better than expected and every number was better than anybody could have hoped for. And we were just moments away from success.
How would they explain that away, Simon?
Propaganda.
Yeah, but
propaganda. There would be
they just make up.
They would be. You know how when you read in the United States, like in any newspaper, every story starts with like John Smith was thinking of that. There's always a person.
Yeah.
And then this person had this situation. And then they introduce a couple of other people, right? And then they start weaving a story, all of a sudden a very big story coming out of the small story. Like he couldn't get food and therefore there's a crisis. And this is just an example of a crisis.
All right.
The same technology was applied. So this guy is a great worker and he's just got a bonus and they're moving into a new apartment. And therefore suddenly that means all the citizens are doing great and everybody's moving in the new apartment and the whole thing, presented that way.
Right.
But as the diversion between reality and rhetoric kept deepening and deepening and deepening, it became clear to us very early in the 70s, to most people much later in the 80s, and even by the time they collapsed in 91, it became clear that the system was in a crisis, even though ostensibly it was not in any crisis. Right. Ostensibly, Nixon and Brezhnev met in the early 70s, Helsinki Accords, some supposed relaxation of civil rights, supposedly. And so I want to emphasize again that everything I'm describing, these are soft issues. These are not hard issues. Of course, people coming from the West could see how badly the Soviet people lived relative to the West. But living inside the Soviet Union, it's not like people were going hungry. And yes, everybody had one coat and one pair of shoes until it had to be replaced. But it didn't feel, without knowing any better, like this was some disaster underway, So because my father was a freelance photographer, he was constantly in a situation where he had to pay bribes to get jobs, which he didn't want to do. So that really was a major problem for him, because corruption, as the pie starts shrinking, corruption increases.
Right.
Right? Because it's a fight for scarce resources. And all of a sudden, just like what we see with the luxury goods right now, all of a sudden there's not enough luxury houses. The prices are going through the roof. It got to the point where to get a pair of Levi's jeans, which were very popular, just like they were here. Mm-hmm. And here they were selling for, $13 at the time or $15, whatever, 501s.
Right.
In the Soviet Union, you had to pay 170 rubles in the black market, which was my mother's salary, monthly salary. She was an engineer, a mechanical engineer with 25 years of experience at that point. Mm. So a monthly salary of an engineer was being spent on jeans. Just like today, you see some watches that are being sold on the gray market because you can't get the Rolex at a store anymore because of this bubble that we're in. They're being sold for, double the sticker price, triple the sticker price.
Yeah.
Which is a monthly salary or even more than monthly salary of a normal middle-class person. So, so these are the little tidbits that I'm just, imparting to you. And so at some point, as I became in my later teens, my father and I sort of sat down and we said, this system is not going anywhere. The symptoms are everywhere and nobody wants to acknowledge it. In fact, when we arrived here, this was the height of the Cold War. The sense was that the Soviet Union was stronger than ever. That this nuclear confrontation was as real as can be. If you read the novels of Ludlum and Clancy, these daring do novels in the early 80s about the Soviet army and the Soviet this and the Soviet that. We left before the Soviets went into Afghanistan, which the lesson there was that there was a short window where people like us, we are Jewish, so there was some deal made between the U.S. government and the Russian and Soviet government that Jewish people would be allowed to reunite with their families and whatever. This was a giveaway the Soviets did for being able to buy grain from the United States after 72 drought at a preferential rate without tariffs. And so the window cracked, the border cracked a little bit. It was extremely difficult to leave. You had to be denounced when you said you wanted to leave. You had to ask to be denounced. because you were a traitor. I mean, who would leave the Soviet paradise, unless they were a complete traitor? You had to pay to give up your citizenship. You had to pay for your education that you got from the government for free. You have to pay them back. You have to pay extraordinary amounts for the visas and exits and whatever. And so we had to sell everything we had just to fund these exit taxes, if you will,
right?
And the payments. You had absolutely no knowledge ahead of time whether you would be allowed to go. Because once you applied for exit visa, which you had to get permission to leave, you declared yourself as a traitor. And if you were not allowed to leave, which some people were not allowed to leave, for reasons nobody knew, like just refused, denied. If your request is denied, you have no job. Nobody will hire you. You have no means of making any living. In the meantime, they kick you out of college already because you asked to leave. So you were kicked out of college. So the risk was not like physically you were going to get killed or something, but you were essentially taking a bet that if you're not permitted to leave, you were screwed, and you were screwed with the whole family, potentially for many, many years.
Yeah, you're like banned from society. Like you're an
exile
pariah from society. Yeah.
That's right. You're a pariah. You can't make a living. You can't do anything. So it was a very high-risk proposition that very, very few people felt strong enough to take up. And a lot of people, just like we see a lot of people now, said, well, yeah, I know it's a bubble. I know, but, it's not yet. It's going to go for a long time. I'm going to think about it. We're not ready yet. We need to do this. We need to do that. We can't give it up yet. I don't want to give the opportunity cost up yet.
Right.
And then, of course, we left on December 1st, 78. On December 1st or 2nd or 3rd, whatever it was, of 1979, the Soviet Union suddenly invaded Afghanistan. The Carter administration imposed the grain embargo, and the Soviets closed the borders. And all these people who weren't ready to take the decision and they were not sure yet and they were waiting, they got an opportunity to wait for another 10 years. Wow. Because the borders did not reopen for 10 years. So what I'm trying to say is the lesson that I learned there is things like contingency plans or decisions based on conviction should be taken when they can be taken.
Yeah.
Not when you think it's the right time to take them.
Yeah, there's that saying that it's better a year early than a day late, huh?
It's either a year early or it's too late, right? Like you can't time these things. And so that was a huge lesson. Showing up in the West with no passport, two grandmothers and parents, nobody speaks English but me, $100 a person, which is all that the Soviets allowed us to exchange into foreign currency, $96, whatever it was, for 5 people. So multiply that times 5. 5 suitcases, 1 suitcase per person, 6 pairs of underwear, 6 t-shirts, anything 6, no more than 6 of anything. That's it. That's basically it. So you start completely from ground zero and maybe from minus whatever.
Yeah.
Now, for me, I was 19. My parents were 46 and 52. I mean, that's not an easy decision,
right?
To leave everything behind. The other thing is, we had at the time, there was absolutely no idea that what happened eventually would actually happen and that the borders would be open. So when people left the way we did, the party for saying goodbye was essentially awake because the relatives and friends, they came to say goodbye forever.
Right, right.
I mean, there was no sense that this would ever be reversible, that we would ever be able to go back, or they would ever be allowed to come see us. So the reason I'm describing it is just to impart that in retrospect, it all sounds like great timing, what a great trade, quote unquote. Yeah, no, you don't know that when it's happening. You're just taking a major leap of faith based on conviction and assessment that there is no future here. The system doesn't work. It's getting more and more corrupt. Faith in the system is wavering. And of course, all these trends have continued until they completely spun out of control. Theft and graft, unlimited.
Right.
We can talk about the concept of bezel. I don't know if John Kenneth Galbraith's concept of bezel, which I think is extremely appropriate for our situation right now.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm just thinking on a much smaller scale. People like in California right now. When you're talking through this, it seems that it would really resonate with people like that. And I've written down so many questions, but please continue on that thought.
So one thing that was very big in our decision. Remember, I said my dad constantly was solicited for bribes to get jobs, freelance jobs, by the editors from the publishing houses who were in a fixed salary. There were government officials in a fixed salary who were doling out government contracts that paid a decent amount of money to independent professionals. Right. Not very much unlike what's going on with government contracts in this country. And so John Kenneth Galbraith in the 60s came up with the idea of bezel, which is essentially a derivative of the word embezzlement. And the way he explained this is that embezzlement is a very special crime. It's, in addition to all normal kinds of theft and robbery and whatever other financial crimes, it has an element of time. And sometimes the time that it takes from the moment when the embezzlement starts to the moment when it's discovered can go on for years and even decades. Bernie Madoff is a perfect example.
Right.
And in that period of time, there exists a sort of dual state mentality where the embezzlers know that they have stolen the money. And the embezzled don't feel that they're any worse off because they think the money is still there. But the money is already gone, just like with Madoff. Everybody got their statements. The statements had numbers on them, but there was no money. And so Galbraith posited that bezel is this amount of money that lives in this in-between space, between it's already disappeared and it's yet to be discovered. The disappearance is yet to be discovered. Okay? During depressions, bezel contracts severely because trust in counterparties collapses. People become very cautious about handing their money to other people. Only people with a long, trusted track record of probity and integrity are able to get money. The ventures that get funded have to be extremely well positioned and not levered and all kinds of stuff. Whereas during the good times, as the good times progress and the longer they progress, more and more graft starts happening because people become trusting, the audits become weak, the risk management becomes weak. We saw that in the run-up to the 2008 crisis when securities were being rated AAA that were real junk and defaulted and people lost trillions of dollars. Right. Look at the crypto situation right now. We just learned about these two brothers in India, 18 and 20, who absconded with like $4 billion. Now, in what kind of a business environment could you have an 18-year-old and 20-year-old abscond with that kind of money?
Yeah.
Like who would trust them with that kind of money?
Yeah, I mean, and you can go down the list of publicly traded companies that have done things today without any issue that 20 years ago they would have been potentially put in jail.
Correct. So according to Galbraith, the bubbles are accompanied by higher and higher bezel. So it's not like there's not graft or criminality in the economy. There's always corruption in the economy. Mm-hmm. There's always corruption in government. The question is, what is the percent?
Right.
Is it a small percent of what's going on, or is it systemically pervasive? And so one major telltale that we felt at the time, and by the way, when I say we felt at the time, a lot of these things that I'm sharing with you now have become more clear to me since then. Like we were doing things, maybe not articulating it quite the way I'm articulating it now, even to ourselves. We just felt inside that this was like not a good situation that wasn't going in the right way. But what I now realize in the Soviet Union, starting in like second half of 70, the bezel was getting out of control. Everybody had to be paid a bribe for anything. You couldn't get anything without paying somebody else. People weren't getting put in jail people were getting away with complete murder. They were stealing truckloads. You'd get caught for stealing a loaf of bread, but if you steal, half the factory, it's no problem. Because then you pay off the inspector and the auditor and this and that and the other thing, and that was that. So the moral standards have collapsed. Ethical standards have collapsed. And again, this is not like Pollyanna thing. There's always graft. It's just a question of how much. It's like, is it completely the way the business is done, or is it just some percentage of, criminals on whatever, dishonest people on the side? So that was a key factor, I think. I've never read, of course, about bezel when I was in the Soviet Union. I've learned about it since. So I feel like those are the kinds of things, the diversion between gulf, building and building up between what the political rhetoric was and what the reality on the ground was, what people's experience was. Complete lack of decency in conduct of business affairs or any kind of commercial affairs. It's a free-for-all. Then what started happening is that when regular people saw that the elites, or whatever you want to call, this is not all of these loaded words. I'm not using them as loaded words.
Right.
I'm literally using elite as the upper part of society, the professionals and the business people, top officials, people who are the establishment, it's called. They see as the establishment becoming more and more corrupt. And with impunity, then people say, well, what am I, stupid? Why shouldn't I steal? And so instead of trying to bring the system back and clamp down on corruption and fraud, it becomes a free-for-all, which, again, I think the crypto phenomenon and what's going on with Robinhood and what we're seeing with a lot of sort of everybody and his brother getting into speculation of all kinds,
or mortgages in 2006-07.
And by the way, yesterday, I don't know if you saw, but there was the Biden administration replaced the head of I forgot the name of this agency. It's the agency that oversees Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And with the idea, specifically, that we need to give more mortgages to people with low credit.
Right.
No down payment, more mortgages for people with low credit. That's their solution to the fact that people can't afford houses, which are out of control because they're controlling the interest rates and they're printing money. So the money is going into assets, and the asset prices are going up, and people who own assets are buying more houses, and BlackRock is buying up houses. I mean, all that. It's a completely wrong answer to it's pouring gasoline on the fire instead of fixing it. But it's happening right now. It's like literally yesterday. So we're going to go back to repeat 2006, 2007 experience, I guess. We're going to issue more, and then we're going to repackage them into CDOs, and we're in the AAA rating you're going to put on them and all that. I don't know if we're going to get to that, but that's pretty much what the administration wants to do right now. So all of these types of things that I'm describing to you, this popular response of disrespecting authority, saying, fine, if they're going to steal, we're all going to steal. There's no end to that then. There's just no end to that. Because then the entire civil society essentially disintegrates.
What's the root cause of that? I'm sure you've put a lot of thought into this. Is it just the more central planning you have, therefore resources are not allocated efficiently, and then you have this divergence with the two classes, and that creates the social unrest, and then the trajectory just kind of gets almost exponential, or for lack of a better word, before it all disintegrates? Or what's at the root cause of creating that in the first place?
I honestly think, I don't know if it's true or not. Obviously, this is a huge sociological and economic question,
right,
that many people are trying to answer. I think common sense suggests that it's probably economics. Because think of a lot of examples. Like Singapore is a dictatorship, but so there is no civil rights there, but there is no discontent there either. Really, I mean, people grumble, but the economy is very good. Nobody's starving. Everybody's having a decent life.
But you can't chew gum, Simon. But you can't chew gum.
They cannot chew gum. Well, you can chew gum, you just can't spit it out.
Or you just can't buy it. Yeah, you can't buy it.
Yeah, right. And when you fly into Singapore, when you on the plane and they give you the landing card, it says on it in red across the death to drug traffickers.
Yeah.
So it always makes me like, wait a minute, do I have sleeping pills? Do I have, like, God forbid, a Valium or something that my wife gave me to sleep? With a jet lag. No fooling around. No fooling around. So I think it's economics. And just like Russian Revolution happened on the back of a economic collapse in World War I, just like Hitler came in the wake of Weimar hyperinflation and economic collapse post World War I, 10 years later or whatever. I think that's what it is. And so the Soviet Union, clearly the economic system couldn't work. I mean, it wasn't working. And as it kept not working, what the Soviet government did, what the centrally planned government did, they kept overspending. They kept patching it up with subsidies. Oh, so we had a bad crop? Okay, so we're going to pay hard currency and buy grain from America. We're not going to figure out whether we need more land planted, whether we need a different agricultural methods, whether we need something else. We're just going to buy it from the state budget. And then, so these factories are producing shoes at a loss? Well, we're just going to subsidize. And so, I mean, again, does this sound familiar to you?
Yeah, it's the exact same thing. Just the bailouts and zombie corporations and not letting anyone fail. They're not allowing Schumpeter's creative destruction. I mean, every single thing that you're saying just resonates with me. And I can find examples of it just all over right now in what we've been experiencing over the last 2 decades.
I have felt this way for years. And I have a few friends who left the Soviet Union at the time I did, a couple of friends. They feel exactly the same way. Most people who left the East or whatever, behind the Iron Curtain, are very familiar with what's going on, both in political and civil rights area and graft area and propaganda area and in all of these areas. And so this is not new for us. We're about to hit the 90s in the Soviet version, because we are doing what all empires do. We overstep our bounds, we overspend, we overreach, and hubris is leading us down the path of a bad outcome. And I don't think that he didn't say anything different from what I've felt for a long time. I'm just saying it because anybody who has lived through that collapse, and I wasn't there when it happened. I've watched it from here. And we left in 78. This happened in 91. We were 13 years too early, in the trade problems, which I don't regret for a moment, of course. But it's obvious to anybody who has experienced a decline and a collapse of an empire. I also think it's very important to say, and I always try to say that, collapse is a loaded word. People think that when somebody starts saying about collapse of the Soviet Union, a collapse or whatever, Soviet Union collapsed, but Russia is still there. And in fact, flexing its muscles on the global stage. And it's still the largest country in the world, even though the Russian Empire has shrunk after 1991. So I think the collapse of an American empire does not mean Mad Max seen on the streets.
Right.
It just means a reorganization in a very major way of something that we have come to expect to be forever and permanent. And then life goes on in some other way, which, Russians didn't all die, whatever, although many people did, just from desperation. It's a depression. I mean, it's really what it is. It's a depression.
Yeah, you have to have
hyperinflationary depression or deflationary depression, or combination.
But you have to have that deleveraging. deleveraging, and
You
you have to
have
get the
to have
malinvestment
deleverage.
out of the system, the misallocation of
Absolutely.
resources. You've got to get that flushed out. And then it sounds like, starting from scratch, I just wrote this down when you were talking. It's really about if you've got a free market, and whenever people use the word capitalism, I always try to inject the word free market or the words free market, because it's not just about capitalism. You have to have a free market, sound money, private property rights, and rule of law. It sounds like really that's the
Absolutely.
secret sauce.
And that is the secret sauce that made Anglo-Saxon financial capitals the financial capitals of the world. And it starts with the British tradition of property rights enforcement through the courts.
Mm-hmm.
London was the major financial center, and then New York took over. And when people do business in Russia, they have no idea whether at one point everything's going to get taken away from them. And if they go to court, the judge is probably paid off by the other side.
Right.
The United States, at least up to now, you knew that you may lose your money, but if there's a commercial dispute, you can go in front of a judge who's going to adjudicate this dispute, and you may not get what you want, you may lose the case, but it's not going to be a crooked adjudication. There will literally be a judge who would look at the facts from both sides, or a jury or whatever, and they will not necessarily render decision in your favor, but there would be some level of impartiality and honesty about it. And people felt. I mean, this is the key. This is absolutely key. When everything is rigged, including the legal system, that's where we're going in a very wrong direction. Yeah. And clearly feels like we're in that situation.
Yeah,
at least to me, it feels that way.
Yeah, I think because the way it looks to me in the United States, or at least in the West, is everything has become so politicized that non-bias judge just doesn't exist anymore. Maybe at a local level, but like the Supreme Court, as an example, each one of those judges has a political agenda, and it's just how many that you have that pushes the narrative or the case one side or to the other. And it seems like, we're seeing that at a very, very high level in the United States right now.
Well, this political polarization is, I think what's important to, I was thinking about it before talking to you. I think what's very important to keep in mind is some of these things that we're describing, some may think that these are symptoms of a crisis. And in a way, they're symptoms of a crisis, but they're an integral part of the crisis. Like, for example, big bezel, big asset bubble, interest rates at 5,000-year lows, asset prices at 5,000-year highs, major deficits, zombie companies. These are all interrelated things. One gives rise to the other. They all appear at the same time in these types of late stage sort of pre-reorganization times, if you will.
Right.
Because they're not just symptoms of a condition. They're the outcome. They're the result of the condition. Mm-hmm. Now, the real question, this is the biggest question that I haven't answered yet to myself. All of these things we're describing, the graph, the socialism that we're seeing and all that, command economy, at the bottom of it all lies some disability of our economic system to deliver prosperity to everybody. And that disability, I guess, or inability, crystallized itself probably in the tail end of the 60s, which is why we were forced off the gold standard, because we just ran out of real money. And then we started printing money, what the Soviets have been doing. The reason we can do it for a lot longer than the Soviets is because the U.S. credibility, it's all about credibility. Countries like Zimbabwe don't have any credibility. They still, or Venezuela or Argentina. So their credit gets pulled very quickly. The great empires like the United States have a tremendous reserve of credibility. So we've been spending down our credibility reserve by essentially spending more than we make and expecting that this is going to be perpetual. And of course, we're going to continue to expect that right up until the moment when this whole thing ends in some form or another. and transitions to something else.
Do you think so? I mean, one of my questions is when you guys left the Soviet Union, why come to the United States? There were a lot of other countries I'm assuming you could have gone to. And the reason I'm asking that is because some people are probably watching this right now and saying to themselves, okay, I understand what Simon is saying. And to me, the United States feels like what he was describing Russia in 1978. So I want to look for that plan B. I want to set up my own plan B. But today, where is the United States of 1978? Ironically, do you think it's in Eastern Europe because they have the experience that you had with socialism and central planning, and it's in their recent memory? They lived through it, and therefore they're less likely to go down that path in the next 10 or 20 years?
I don't know. This is very hard. I mean, there's this concept of nomad capitalism, as you know.
Yeah, sure.
Where people are trying to untether themselves and they're going to float up there, That's not how we were thinking about it. We came to the United States for a number of reasons, but, for once, we're being Jewish. There's a very large Jewish community here. Perversely, there's Russia, particularly Western Russia, where I grew up in St. Petersburg, is a cradle of, one of the cradles of Western civilization in terms of museums. To the credit of the Soviets, I have to say that they have maintained the cultural empire, Russian Empire, if you will. There were 2 philharmonic orchestras. There were 2 opera companies in St. Petersburg. There were, world-class museums. And all of that was available to those people who wanted to partake of that. Excellent theater, excellent, Broadway-type shows, their version of that. And so it was fairly seamless. It was very difficult culturally at a commercial culture, like social culture level and language. But at a intellectual culture level, there's really no difference between Russia or London or New York, because the same opera companies and the same plays and the same authors and the same literature and the same everything. So if you're an intellectual person, that was a fairly easy thing to do. So my father, for example, who did freelance work and mostly worked at the Hermitage doing art books, ended up working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the photo studio doing art books. So it was a tremendous switch, but at the same time, it was lesser cultural switch that you may think. I don't see a place. I mean, people say that Asia is on the upswing, but I don't. But life is not just about the money, and life is about community and children and culture and common bonds and social life and things like that. I can't see, for example, so the reason I brought up nomad capitalism is people have this idea that they're just going to live in some country where they don't know the culture, they don't know the language. They're just going to sort of float on the cloud above it all, saving money on tax. They're going to have 3 properties, they're going to pay taxes nowhere. I think, to me, it's a bit of ass backwards, because ultimately it's about the community. It's about, bringing up your children with some values, being a part of something, as opposed to just in some, gated community with a few other Americans or something like that.
But that same argument could have been used against you making the decision that you made back in 1978 from your fellow Russians, right?
So it was very easy, yes, and it was made, and that's why you said you were a traitor. But it was very easy in the Soviet Union to decide where to go. It was very hard to get out of the Soviet Union, but it was very easy to decide where to go.
I see.
The problem I think we have here is it's very easy to leave the United States. Where do you go?
Right.
Where do you go? Where is the United States of 1978? I don't see it. That culturally would be enough similar that you could put down roots. And, we came here to resettle, to acculturate, to build a life. We didn't come here to save on taxes or, to have a passport from whatever country so that we can do whatever we wanted, somewhere in business class over the Atlantic. I mean, that wasn't the idea, and so I don't know where one would go today. Some people go to Puerto Rico, some people go to, Singapore, some people go to, Europe, I don't think Western Europe, when the crisis starts, can be any better than what's going on here. So maybe we're going to have to ride it out. I mean, maybe we have to band together with like-minded people and ride it out and hope that, this depression resolves itself in something better than what it might resolve itself.
How do you think? Okay, so let's assume for a moment that we're on the same path as, to a certain degree, that Russia was on in the late 1970s when you guys decided to leave. How do you think? Number one, do you think we can get off this road to serfdom, let's say? And then number two, what do you think would have changed in the 1970s in Russia, if anything, if we would have had the internet? And therefore people could communicate much more efficiently. And do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I do. But, it's very hard to say.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard to say because empires this just keeps happening time and again and again and again. I mean, we see that in when we're young and we're boisterous, we don't pay attention to risk. We want to take risks, and some maybe don't make it, but most make it. And it's this risk taking that propels us forward. And as we grow older, we become more cautious. We want to take less risks, and we want, the bailouts is not wanting to take the risk because nobody within the system knows, like, what if we let it go? Like, what's going to happen?
Yeah. Maybe the internet would have decreased the Basel. You know what I mean? Decreased that time frame.
George, what's going on? Look at what it's done to the bezel in this country right now.
Yeah.
Internet is increasing the bezel.
Right.
Exponentially.
Right.
I think the internet is overrated in the sense that it is a revolutionary technology that enables us to do the same things we've always done, but in a slightly more efficient or maybe significantly more efficient way. What is it that we're doing on the internet? We're corresponding with each other. We're reading newspapers. We're looking for sex. We're looking for loved ones. What are we doing? I mean, isn't this what people have always been doing anyway?
Right.
We're watching shows. So you have to get up off your duff and you have to go somewhere to watch a show. Now, with television, you can sit in your underwear on your couch and you can watch the show and get fat without going anywhere.
Right.
But what is it that you're doing? You're consuming entertainment, which is now delivered to you in your house, as opposed to you having to go and consume it at a place where it's produced. But what are you consuming again? It's the actors on a stage acting something out, but it's recorded so that it can be seen over and over again, as opposed to one time.
Mm. Yeah.
So is it revolutionary or is it evolutionary?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So how do you think there's a way that we can get off this road to serfdom, for lack of a better term?
I sure hope so. But, I recently re-listened. There's an interview out there. Unfortunately, it's in Russian, so it's difficult for people to get the value from that. It was in 1964, the head of the Russian provisional government, who was in power from the moment the Tsar was declared. It was the only democratic Russian government, like for 6 months. From the moment the Tsar was overthrown in early 1917 and until Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik coup in the fall of that year was deposed. And so the head of that government ended up in the United States. His name was Alexander Kerensky. And in 1964, he was already in his 80s. Somebody interviewed him. And he gave like an hour and a half interview, which, I mean, it's incredible. This is a first-hand account of somebody who was at the pinnacle of the events, right. in the. And what I want to share from that is a couple of insights that I found very relevant to what we have now and instructive. And so we say, like, are we on the road to serfdom? What's going to happen? How's going to happen? So it starts out, the interview strictly covers from the fall of 16 to the fall of 17. Like, what happened? Like, how did this thing go south the way it did?
Yeah.
So the first thing he said, the crisis started in the fall of 17. Nobody realized. I was 16. Nobody realized. The Tsar was deposed in February of 17. So 5 months before it happened, nobody realized. Not only did nobody realize it, the consensus was for exactly the opposite. The consensus was that the Tsar's administration was clamping down on civil liberties, in fact, was in the riding seat, and the dark road of repression was ahead. That civil liberties were constrained, and the Tsar was going to take over, clamp down even more. That the deep state, let's use today's language, was in complete control and clamping down. Okay? The tradition that fell apart, just for context, the Tsars were in power for 800 years, leading up to that moment.
Right.
And the Romanov dynasty was in power for 300 years. And then he says the whole thing went down in 72 hours.
Wow. After 800
Between
years.
Friday, after 800 years and 300 years of this dynasty, from Friday to Sunday night,
wow,
it all went up in smoke. So thing number one, the consensus was for the opposite of what was actually happening. They thought the Tsar was in the strongest position ever, when in fact he was 3 months away from the whole thing coming apart. Okay? The second thing, when it went down, and I don't want to get into details of what happened, but it was a completely serendipitous event that was caused by a minor incident, and a couple of regiments went out and supported the parliament, and the whole thing just ended up a revolution. I mean, literally overnight. The other thing is Kerensky, who ended up running the government, which was overthrown by the communists, had personally said, I have no idea. I was on no list to be a part of any government. He was a lawyer and a liberal politician. So he was an accidental tourist, basically. He was a person from the left, if you will, who was not in any highly elevated position. He wasn't, quote unquote, a congressman by that standard, but just one of many. He wasn't in any particular. So he was invited to join the government as a compromise to let the left into a more conservative government because of what happened over the weekend, and the Tsar felt, and they wanted support of more broader support. So he was brought in. This man ended up the head of the government in 3 months, and in 3 months he lost. What I see here is like, here's an accidental tourist who gets thrust, not prepared, not competent for this. I mean, competent person, not competent for that job.
Right.
Essentially to be the head of a government where then he's centrist, where the left wing from him is willing to kill and maim, and he doesn't have what it takes to hold him back. So A, nobody knew it was going to happen. B, people who ended up in control were accidentally thrust into that position. In that case, they weren't up to the job. And the whole thing went south, and 70 years of disaster ensued. So when you ask me what's going to happen, how could anybody know what's going to happen?
Do you think Biden's that guy? Do you see similarities with Biden?
Like I said, all we know is that the preconditions, we can see the underlying condition.
Right.
We can see that the underlying, where I lost the train of thought before when I said we were forced off the gold standard in the 70s because we could not grow the way we wanted to grow, and we couldn't generate well, so what in my mind is, does capitalist system actually work in this environment? The reason I say that is because capitalism, the economic system, I'm not talking about free market system in general, I'm just saying the system that we've had that has produced phenomenal wealth and was completely incredible. It works when there's growth, when there's expansion. It is based on growth and expansion.
Right.
What happens when the whole world is a part of the system? What happens when instead of growing, the population starts flattening or contracting, which is happening? How does this demographic situation that we're in, what does that do to the ability to run the system the way we understand it to be successful in the past?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in other words, can we get back to basics, or the basics are no longer there to be gotten back to? Because we don't have another economic model for generating prosperity for everybody. We know central planning is not it.
Yeah. And they're just trying to create growth by printing money.
And so that's an attempt to defer the inevitable.
Yeah, which exacerbates the problem.
So the reason I'm concerned, and this is how I got into gold, is I'm concerned that everybody thinks we have an asset bubble, but we also have a consumption bubble. And when there's a consumption bubble, it's not just the valuations are overstated, which of course they are. The earnings are overstated. Everything is overstated. What is the North Star in this constellation? What doesn't move here? Is there something that doesn't move? Is there an anchor here that you can tie yourself to and ride the storm? What is it? Because all financial assets are valued based on earnings, based on cash flows, based on interest rates, and all of these things are in flux. And because of these massive subsidies and money printing, the earnings are higher than they would be. Because if government is spending $3 trillion it doesn't have, companies are selling $3 trillion worth of goods and services.
Right.
That otherwise couldn't be consumed.
There's no price discovery in anything. Not only is there no price discovery at the grocery store, but there's also no price discovery in the stock market.
In anything, right. And
so then that takes us to gold. And is gold the North Star? I mean, is that how you see it? And what can, I'm assuming one thing that people can do to protect themselves from whatever's happening in the future, or maybe they could have done in Russia if it would have been legal, is to actually own gold. I mean, is that something that we can hang on to? And how do you see gold through the framework, having the experiences that we've just gone over?
Well, the question is, so first of all, the way I came to gold is not through gold. The way I came to gold is by asking all these questions that you and I are talking about, and then asking a question in the wake of that. So, okay, so if there's a non-trivial, means more than 1 in a million, if there's a real chance that this system has to get reorganized, then what will survive? Okay, well, of course, all real assets will survive. Property will survive, land will survive, Picassos will survive, Rembrandts will survive, diamonds will survive, copper ore will survive, warehouses filled with whatever, lithium will survive, all that survives. The question is who owns it, at what price, and all that. The reason I came to gold out of all that is because gold happens to be the only financial asset that is also a tangible asset. There are many tangible assets. They will all survive. But not all of them are practical to own. I mean, warehouses with copper is not something a normal person can maintain, and it's complicated and difficult and whatever. So the way gold emerged as what it is because it is very valuable per unit of volume. So you can concentrate a significant amount of value in a fairly small physical space, right? It's very dense. It's 19 times denser than water. It's genuinely rare. So you cannot print more gold. You cannot even find more gold. It takes 10 years to get the mine going from discovery to production. So it's inelastic. The supply is highly inelastic. The most important thing about gold is A, it's scarce. B, of course, it's permanent, meaning it's a molecular structure that humans cannot rearrange. So it's just there. But the most important thing is it's independent. It doesn't have a counterpart. See, everything you and I are talking here about is counterparty risk because all of the players in this constellation, and that includes crypto world, because there has to be miners, there has to be electricity, there has to be access to electricity at a regular price. Right. You have to have access to the internet. Internet service provider has to allow certain data packets to go through. I mean, there's a lot behind the scenes in the networks that is people think is like free world there, but it's not totally a free world. And the whole infrastructure, for example, for Bitcoin mining, I mean, it has to exist and continue to be feasible and to exist for the asset to have value. Nothing has to exist for gold to be what it is. Nothing. You can have a coin in your pocket. Of course, if you store it in the warehouse, there has to be some infrastructure, but you can then withdraw it from the warehouse, dig it into ground, and keep it there for 100 years, and it doesn't matter. It's going to be the same 100 years later. That property of gold is not very highly valued because it sounds like very big deal, like this is total out there thinking. But the desire for an asset that doesn't have a counterparty and is completely independent from the financial system, from all kinds of systems, portable, can be kept, at a house, can be kept in a foreign country, can be kept wherever, and doesn't spoil. Nothing happens to it. That desire is inversely correlated to confidence in counterparties, financial arrangements, property rights.
Right.
In other words, the infrastructure of life, of society, the rules that we take for granted, that they are there, right? And so you can think of gold as an asset. It's not a deflation hedge. It's not this or that or the other. It's not what anything people think about it. What it is, it's an independent store of value whose value is highest when the risk of everything else is also high. And demand for it is highest when the risk of everything else is high. So it has this quality of an insurance policy that performs when things go bad in some way. When things are going great and in bubbles, gold is not attractive to people because they can make a lot more money doing something else, speculating. That's why people like Warren Buffett don't like and understand gold, because people like Warren Buffett and investors in general, you can think about them as capitalists whose means of production is money. So they're using money to make more money. That's the activity in which they're engaged. It's a risk-taking activity, and that's what they're doing. That's not saving. That's risk-taking. Saving is simply setting aside purchasing power in a format that will reliably deliver the same purchasing power to you later. Nobody's looking to make profits on their savings account. We used to have savings account where the interest rate was higher than inflation, so you could actually keep up a little bit. So gold is that. And that's why Warren Buffett doesn't understand gold. So what's there to, because it's not means of production. It's a fallow asset. It doesn't do anything with it. Precisely.
And I think
it's
that's
not supposed to do anything.
Exactly. And I think that's why most people don't understand it, is because of the recency bias that we kind of hardwired into our head. And that story going back to 1916 in Russia, how 800 years changed just over a weekend. I mean, that in and of itself is the reason you own gold. Because, what's the saying that they have? It's something that there can be 10 years where not very much happens, and then one day where 10 years happens all at once. I mean, that's why you own gold.
So that revolution, the first revolution, happened in 72 hours. The one in the fall that completely changed the world, the Russian world and world for everybody, took 10 days. So John Reed, an American who was in Russia at the time, wrote a book, 10 Days That Changed the World. There's a movie with Warren Beatty, 10 Days That Changed the World. So yes, everything can go very quickly. And when preconditions are in place, and I believe preconditions are in place, and we've just described some of them, and there are plenty more, it's simply imprudent and it's irresponsible, I would say, to not make some provisions for contingency plans.
Right.
And people are not used to it. People insure their cars, people insure their houses, people insure everything. They don't insure their savings. Have you noticed? There's no concept of, I need to pay a certain amount to insure my savings, my capital. Okay, so if you're a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old, maybe you can make it back. But if you're in your 50s or 60s, you can't make it back. And that's where people are ready for retirement, and they have the most amount of savings, and they're most interested in making even more instead of trying to protect what they have. That's I think is the issue. And maybe that's lack of understanding, that's lack of, it's a post-war time frame when there has not been a systemic crisis in the West since World War II. But if you just dial back in another 30, 40 years, Oh my God! I mean, just look at the 20s and 30s, even in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a disaster.
Yeah.
The 30s were a disaster in this country.
Yeah, and I think another reason is because people have been forced into that speculative mindset, with stocks as an example, because of the bezel you were talking about earlier in the form of inflation. You know, when you were talking about that bezel, that's the first, and when you were describing it, that's the first thing that came into my mind was inflation, that the government is picking your pocket. People don't consciously realize it. The only thing they know is that they have to buy some sort of asset that goes up at 15, 20, 30% per year just to try to get ahead. Therefore, they look at gold and it seems unattractive in that light.
And it isn't attractive at that light because there's no experience with real disruptions, right? Where suddenly your bank account is not there, I mean, think of what happened in the 1930s. I mean, cash was king. Cash was king, except nobody had cash. Why didn't they have cash? Because their cash was in the bank. Where was the bank? Bust.
Yeah, counterparty, right?
That's right, counterparty risk. So they had bonds. My grandparents had bonds. So what? The government defaulted on the bonds.
Yeah.
So maybe those governments won't default on the bonds outright. So maybe they're trying to inflate. They're trying to pay you back in future dollars, which are buying a lot less. See, this is why gold has had this history. It's the most boring thing in the world. It doesn't do anything. It sits there. But boy, it buys that ounce of gold, just keeps buying the same thing. Yeah, there are times when it buys less, and there are times when it buys a lot more. Usually it buys less and booms, and it buys a lot more and busts. But over time, it just buys the same thing. And that's a very valuable property. It's just people don't put a lot of value on it.
Yeah, very well said. Well, I know that we've gone over an hour. I sincerely appreciate your time. That was really a fascinating conversation, Simon. For my viewers and listeners who want to find out more about what you do, where can they go?
bullionreserve.com. Just like that, bullionreserve.com. Or they can find me on Twitter, although I've kept quiet lately because, what's there to say? I think everybody gets it. How long can you pound the table on the same thing over and over again? People who get it. People who don't get it, not going to get converted. It's S_Mikhailovich on Twitter. So those are the places to find me.
Awesome. Simon, I appreciate it. I can't wait to have another conversation just like this one in the future.
Great. Thanks, George.
Hi, guys. I'd like to invite each and every one of you to the next Rebel Capitalist Live event. If you are a fan of the Rebel Capitalist show, I guarantee you will love the live event. The next one is Houston, where you can meet and listen to speakers, all your favorites from the Rebel Capitalist show. People such as Dr. Ron Paul, Chris Cole, Lynn Alden, Luke Gromen, just to name a few. If you want to check out the rest of the speaker list and find out how you can attend, we'll put a link in the description below, or you can just go to rebelcapitalistlive.com. This is an event where you can learn to build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments. But it's not just about building wealth. It's about increasing your freedom and networking with like-minded individuals, fellow rebel capitalists. It's an amazing event. I know you'll absolutely love it. Check out rebelcapitalistlive.com, and I will see you in Houston.